pleasure to join everyone at the Queensland AI Hub this afternoon. And I'd just like to start as well by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today, which is the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, the elders past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us today. As I said, it's a pleasure to come back to the Queensland AI Hub. It's great to be co-presenting alongside our colleagues from University of Queensland as well. And I'd just like to acknowledge Steve Lockey, who can't join us today as well, from University of Queensland, another one of our authors in this report, and the contributions from my colleagues, Rossana Bianchi, Ali Akbari, and Rita Fentner van Vlissingen, who also helped with this report and the subsequent model that followed it as well. And there's a number of reasons why the development of Trustworthy AI Matters. Ali, as you noted in your introduction, Nicole's going to share the recent joint research into Australian attitudes towards trust in AI. And I guess just in terms of setting up the context for that, I want to share with you why we see this as an important issue for our firm, our economy, our communities, and national prosperity more broadly, because it is a big issue in some senses. And the first of these, of course, is the ubiquitous nature of the technology in our everyday lives. So the smart speakers in our homes, our traffic navigation and wayfinding applications, the social media we use, the ride sharing and email filters in our everyday lives all rely on AI. And increasingly, this technology is being used in our workplaces to support things such as intelligent automation, advanced data analytics from the back office to the front office. We're doing this across our supply chains right through to the customer and employee experience. So AI has an increasingly important role to play in our organisations as well as our day-to-day lives. The second reason, of course, is that AI is also a cornerstone technology of the fourth industrial revolution, a revolution that's been described by Klaus Schwab as a fusion of technologies that is blurring the lines between the physical, the digital, and the biological spheres. And this is a fusion that promises new solutions to 21st century challenges relating to areas such as healthcare, climate change, agricultural sustainability, and productivity, all things with which the Queensland AI Hub has the potential to generate new solutions in for us as we look into the future. And with these opportunities, of course, there's also the potential to revolutionise the workplace and urban environments. And it's a fusion that will be much harder to realise or slower to achieve and more economically expensive if we don't trust in the technology. That's why this trust matters so much. The third reason why we might think trust in AI matters is the economic potential. So the potential to leave money on the table if we don't get this right. So the CSIRO estimated in 2019 that AI and AI-related technologies could contribute a $315 billion boost to the Australian economy by 2028. So the economic stakes are real, and with the pandemic driving an acceleration of digitisation across our economy, the potential economic benefit could be much higher. And it is true, and it is trust that will act as the flywheel to accelerate these outcomes. The fourth reason I wanted to mention is that in line with this, the technology does also bring some very real risks and concerns about the use of AI. So real potential impacts in terms of the loss of agency or impacts to privacy, potential for harm through discrimination and bias, and the expert predictions that we've all seen related to potential job loss and the economic and social prosperity that we value that go hand in hand with those jobs that could be lost from that sense. And often it is vulnerable people who are most likely to be at risk and least able to access remedy. So the ethical implications demand we take a considered and thoughtful approach to the development, application, and management of AI. And finally, it is also the fact that trust itself matters. How we as businesses and organisations build and maintain trust is critical to our reputations. Increasingly, the hero of our businesses will be a mix of people and technology. So the successful implementation of AI that is trustworthy will be critical to maintaining reputation and supporting business growth. That's why this survey matters. That's why these insights are so important. And with that, let me hand over to Nicole to take us into a deeper dive into how Australians actually think about trust in AI.
Thanks so much, James. Wonderful overview. And what I'll do now is I'll share some slides to introduce our report. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, great, excellent. Okay, So what I'm going to do is just spend around, 10 or so minutes going through some of the highlights of our survey. I should say at the outset that we had two key objectives with the survey. So first of all, it was about understanding and benchmarking Australians' trust in AI. We are planning to track this over time. And also to understand the public's expectations around the development, governance and regulation of AI, to understand their key challenges and more broadly, their attitudes towards AI. So the insights that I'm sharing today are based on over 2,500 Australians. We collected the data in late June and early July this year. And I'd really like to acknowledge my UQ co-authors, Steve Lockey and Caitlin Curtis, who are really instrumental in bringing this research to life. And also the wonderful team at KPMG, which include James, as well as Ali, Rosanna, Rita and Richard. Okay, so one of the key questions that we were asking of in our survey was, do Australians trust AI? And the key finding here is that essentially most Australians are unwilling or ambivalent about trusting in AI systems. So you can see here about 40% expressed an unwillingness to rely on the output or recommendations of AI systems, and about 45% report an unwillingness to share their information with an AI system, even if that's required to make it functional. So this was quite a surprise to us that the trust is relatively low here. You can see that it's really only around a quarter to a third of people who show that real willingness to use AI systems currently. So we also further asked about Australians' acceptance of AI. And again, the key headline here was really that Australians generally accept or tolerate AI, but few actually are embracing or approving of it. So if you look at the graph here, you can see that around 2 out of 5 Australians are accepting AI, but we see about a third in that reject or tolerate level, and only around a quarter in that approve and embrace level. So we can see that there is further to go here in terms of enhancing trust and acceptance of these systems. Now, as you may expect, segments of the population differ in terms of their acceptance, support and trust of AI. So what we can see here is that younger people, particularly Generation Z and millennials, tended to have higher trust than the older generations and were more supportive of AI systems as well. And we also see the similar trend for people who have computer science experience. So whether that's a full degree or whether they've just done a course in it, they were also more likely to support AI and to trust AI compared to those who don't have that kind of background and understanding and knowledge. So who do Australians trust to develop and use AI then? Well, what we found here, as you can see in the graph, is that Australian universities and research institutes, as well as the Australian Defence Forces, Australians were most confident in them in terms of developing and using AI. You can see around half of the population have high or complete confidence in these entities, and about another third moderate confidence. In contrast, if we look down towards the bottom of the graph, we see that commercial organisations are the ones that Australians have the least confidence in. We see it's really only around a quarter that have that high or complete confidence, and about a third say that they have no or low confidence in commercial organisations to develop and use AI, and similarly with federal and state government. So one potential opportunity here may be for commercial AI companies as well as the government to collaborate with the more trusted entities like the universities, research institutions in the development of AI, particularly initially when this is quite a new technology for so many people. So one of the goals of the survey was to determine what practices and principles are important for Australians to trust in AI. And to answer this question, we asked about the importance of 40 practices around 8 principles, what we call principles for trustworthy AI. And you may want to know, well, where did these come from? Many of you may be aware of the European Commission have a set of principles for trustworthy AI. And here in Australia, we also have released a set of AI ethical principles. So we drew on those as well as others to collate these 8 practices. And the key finding here is that every one of these practices underlying these 8 principles was seen as highly important for the public's trust in AI systems. So this provides very clear public endorsement for these principles and practices, and in some ways offers a bit of a blueprint for developing and using AI in a way that supports trust. So as you can see here, the public is really expecting AI to be developed in a way which gives a lot of assurances around its technical robustness and safety, and that the right checks have taken place before AI is released into the market around that. That there's appropriate data privacy, security and governance of these systems, that human agency is maintained and that there is some appropriate human oversight, particularly when there's in those high risk applications, that there's appropriate transparency and explainability. This is not just a black box. We can dig below the surface and understand how the AI is making its decisions or outcomes. That the systems are used in a way which is fair and doesn't result in any discrimination, and particularly is inclusive also for people with a range of abilities. And that there's appropriate accountability and contestability mechanisms in place. So if something does go wrong, people can contest the outcome. And importantly, that people are supported in their literacy to understand AI systems and how they function. And perhaps most importantly, that the unintended or potential risks that may occur from AI systems, particularly when used at scale in society, that these have been looked at and appropriate mitigation plans have been put in place. So what are Australians' views on AI regulations then? Well, to contextualise this, we found that the vast majority of Australians, 96%, believe that AI regulation is needed. And this finding corroborates those of other recent attitude surveys conducted in Europe and the US that also show a strong desire for regulation. The interesting finding here, as you can see in the graph, is that most Australians either disagree or are ambivalent that current regulations and laws here in Australia are sufficient to make AI use safe. And part of this may be because the large majority of Australians, 81%, believe that the impact of AI on society is uncertain and unpredictable. So this helps us to understand why there's such a strong desire for strengthening the regulatory framework. The desire for regulation can also be explained by Australians' views of on basically the benefits and the risks of AI. So what you can see here in the green bars is where we asked people around AI systems in general. And when we asked about that, we can see that most believe that the benefits outweigh the risks. But it's important to also acknowledge that about a third see the benefits and the risks as about equal, and about a quarter see the risks as actually greater than the benefits of using these systems. What we show in the purple bars relates to specific AI systems. So we actually ask questions around 4 particular applications of AI that are currently in use. So these were the use of AI to support decision-making around health diagnosis, or in predictive policing, or in personal financial investments, or in HR hiring and promotion type situations. And what we find is that when you look at those specific applications, we see that people are even less convinced that the benefits outweigh the risks. However, there was some variation when we look at specific applications, and in particular, the use of AI systems in health diagnosis was one area where people generally saw the benefits as quite strongly outweighing the risks. Okay, so just a little more on this regulatory kind of focus. The good news is that organisations don't necessarily have to wait for those regulations to come up to speed in order to shore up trust. So what we found was that the large majority of Australians say that they would be more willing to use an AI system if there was some kind of assurance mechanism in place, such as an independent body that was conducting regular reviews of the AI ethics of the systems, or using some sort of code of conduct within the organisation governing AI and how it should be used. If there was an AI ethics review board, similar to what we have in the universities where we have research ethics committees. So boards or committees that review the ethical considerations that might be applicable to AI systems. There was also support for this idea of a national standards, developing some national standards around AI explainability and transparency, as well as some sort of a certification for AI ethics. So how do Australians feel about AI at work then? Well, this was really interesting, these findings, because essentially Australians are pretty comfortable with AI use at work as long as it's not focused on them. So you can see here that, you know, the majority either have high comfort or moderate comfort in the use of AI for monitoring digital or physical security of the organisation, for automating some tasks like administrative tasks, or augmenting their ability to perform tasks such as picking up patterns in data, or even assisting with some of the physical tasks. Where people feel a lot less comfortable is when that AI system is focused on them as employees. So it's used in recruitment or selection, for example, to help shortlisting processes, or in evaluating employees' performance or comparing it to other employees, or in monitoring people at work. And perhaps part of the fear here is also the fact that most Australians disagree with the idea that AI will create more jobs than it will eliminate. So there is some fear around job loss. Finally, it's important, I think, to understand and contextualise the results in terms of Australians' understanding of AI. So Australians report generally a low understanding of AI. So about 61% say that they don't feel they know a lot about AI. They don't think they really understand when and how it's being used. And we also looked at this question more objectively. So we actually asked people, we gave them a common set of AI systems that are in use, that many people have access to or would use on a pretty regular basis. We asked them first whether they use those common AI applications, and then if they were aware of whether that technology uses AI. And essentially what we found here, as you can see, if we take social media as an example, that even though 78% of people report using social media, only 59%, so around 3 out of 5, were actually aware that social media uses AI. So generally what we see here is a low understanding of when AI is being used, even in really common everyday type applications. Now, the good news here, though, and one that perhaps Ali will be delighted to hear, is that the vast majority of Australians, 86%, want to learn more about AI. So people are leaning in and want to understand this technology more. So finally, we did some modelling around various predictors of trust in artificial intelligence systems. And essentially what we identified here were 4 key drivers. So people are more likely to trust in AI systems when they believe that the current regulations and laws are adequate to make AI safe, but as we see, that's quite challenged. They were less likely to trust in AI systems if they perceive the impact of AI on society as being uncertain. And as we see, a majority of Australians do see that as uncertain. If people believed that AI would create more jobs than it would eliminate, then that positively influenced trust. And also the more familiar or more knowledge that people had around these AI systems, that also facilitated their trust as well. And as we've talked about, younger generations typically accepted trust more than older generations. And what we can also see here is that we did find and corroborate the previous finding that we've seen in research before, that trust in AI systems does lead to AI acceptance. So finally, just taking a step back, quite a big takeaway from our findings, I think, is the need to shore up trust in AI systems. And one very practical way to do that is to make sure that the AI systems that are being used and put out there for citizens or customers to use are actually trustworthy. So earlier this week, we released our second report, which is really a practical report with a model that tries to help organisations to understand the various considerations and the work involved in actually ensuring that AI systems are developed, procured or used in a trustworthy way. So I think at that point, I'll hand back to Ali for some panel discussion and Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Nicole, did you just want to briefly touch on that new report that you said had been some findings on a new report in the last couple of days?
Yeah, so look, with that report, I mean, we actually had a webinar just on Wednesday launching that, and essentially what that report is really about is putting out a model that helps organisations to think about the various work teams and different parts of the organisation that need to integrate and come together in order to ensure that AI throughout its whole life cycle, from sort of development and design all the way through to actual use to even retirement, that across that life cycle, the key risks are understood, that they're mitigated, that they're assessed well, that we have the right kind of governance mechanisms in place. So part of that really comes from the recognition that AI systems do create risks and vulnerabilities that are different to traditional IT systems. And yet many organisations are at a relatively early stage of maturity in terms of really thinking about how do they need to change their existing, whether it's governance or risk mechanisms, what extra kind of processes do they need to have in place to make sure that they're being recognised and managed well. And so we talk about quite a lot of best practice for addressing and ensuring the trustworthiness of those systems.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was fantastic. A really, really deep dive into, many of the issues facing Australians around understanding of AI. It's interesting to note that there are a lot of themes coming up that you probably, well, not that you wouldn't expect, that community wouldn't expect. There's this common narrative that robots are going to steal all our jobs. So, there tends to be a lot of focus around, job creation, people's fear of losing their jobs, but you've uncovered so much more than that in this report, and there's no segment of Australian society that remains untouched by that. There's a huge education piece around that. So thank you very much. I have a number of questions on my page, and I also have about 1 billion inside me, but I'll stick to the ones on the page for now. So this question is for Caitlin initially, but of course the panel more broadly can jump in. Your national survey showed that Australian trust in AI is low. So what does that mean for businesses and organisations that are using or innovating with AI?
Hi, yeah. Well, I think a really interesting story actually emerged with the survey results because, yeah, as you mentioned, on the one hand, there's a low willingness to trust in AI, but at the same time, people are generally accepting of AI, and many of them tend to think that it's likely to bring more benefits and that outweighs the risks, and people tend to want to learn more. So I don't think that it's that there are deeply entrenched negative views about AI. On the contrary, it might be something more like an cautiously optimistic about AI. And I think then there are a lot of opportunities for organizations to communicate back with the community when they're deploying AI. So doing things like communicating really clearly when and where and how they're using AI, and really emphasizing what benefits that is bringing to the consumers, and where the consumers, when they have questions, where can I go to know more? If I have concerns, how do I get those addressed? I think that also our research is indicating that people are going to be more willing to trust in AI systems, as Nicole had mentioned, when there are these structural assurances in place. So things like AI governance boards, internal AI codes of conduct, those are the types of things that organizations can be thinking about and working to develop so to encourage trust in their systems.
Fantastic, great. James or Nicole, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Caitlin covered that well, Ali.
Oh, perfect. Well, yeah, wonderful. Nicole?
I guess, I think one of the key takeaways for me would just be that we can't take it for granted that these, AI-enabled systems or services, products, that they'll necessarily be trusted. So we can't take that for granted. I think we need to assume that people will need some reassurance that they, really do warrant trust. So I think early on, with social media, we saw a lot of sort of just blind trust, people just putting up a whole lot of information, not probably really appreciating necessarily what they were sharing and how that data might be used. And I think, now after, some quite headlines in newspapers, and people are becoming more savvy around the value of their data, around how their data may be used. So it has triggered, I think, some concerns, particularly around that data privacy and sharing and who will end up with this. So I think what we need now is just that sort of proactive approach to building trust. So really, I think recognizing that not everyone is going to be convinced, not everyone's going to jump on board with this. And the people do have really valid concerns around what this may, how these systems might end up impacting society or impacting them as individuals. So I think just recognizing that there are these different risks and vulnerabilities that AI systems open up, you know, particularly around that complexity of machine learning on those massive data sets and how that can make it quite difficult to explain how the system is deriving its output. So how do we get beyond that black box so people can have some confidence around that, particularly when it's being used to make important decisions that impact on citizens? You know, how do we convince people that we aren't going to see any further codification of biases? You know, recognizing that those biases are somewhat inherent in our society, but then, you know, it's another thing to actually be codifying those and reproducing those. So how do we clean that bias out and make sure that that's not a feature of ongoing kind of scandals around AI? I think also the questions around appropriate consent, appropriate use of data sets, I think there's a much greater desire now for people to be really informed about upfront about what data is going to be collected and how it will be used. And we've seen in Europe, you know, the GDPR tight regulations, and I think just the process of bringing those in really elevated people's understanding, because many of these applications then had to declare what they were doing with the data, and I think people learned a lot that they weren't really aware of how their data had been used for several years before that. So I think in some ways people are a little bit on the back foot and just want to be convinced around this. And that's why I think these kind of structural assurance mechanisms, you know, strengthening that regulatory framework can really help to bridge that gap until we become more comfortable with this. And of course, the literacy piece is really important in that. The more people think that we're talking about general AI as in that, you know, beyond its current capabilities, I think people feel more fearful when people recognize that AI actually has limitations and is currently only able to be used in quite specific, narrow kind of applications. And I think people feel a lot more confident.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nicole. James, the next question is for you. And it's the path model highlights a number of things that influence our trust. And one of the things that came out of Nicole's presentation for me that was quite a surprise was the low trust in governments. So what do you think the implications of these trust issues are for policymakers?
Yeah, thank you, Ali. So I think, you know, at a high level, there's two things that sort of stand out to me immediately when you look at that path model. And the first one is that we have those safeguards in place, that this has a significant influence in terms of the amount of trust that people might put in the use and application of AI. And by safeguards there, of course, we're talking about governance and regulations and the policy settings and these sorts of things that are in place. So that does say that from a policymaker perspective, understanding what the regulatory frameworks look like today, how that landscape is currently operating, where are the gaps in that, and what do we need to do to actually provide adequate safeguards to people in communities and organisations in terms of the use and development of these applications will go a long way towards helping to cement that trust piece. And I think this is important because a lot of the work coming out at the moment is looking at how do we provide incentives around developing AI, how do we unlock and unleash the economic potential. And the thing that this is telling us is that one of the things we might need to do is have a regulatory framework in place that helps support the trust, because if we have that there, there'll be uptake, there'll be usage, and we get those benefits that everyone agrees are there to be achieved. The second component, when you look at that path model, is the impact of uncertainty. And I think this was a really interesting element of the survey overall, was Australians were sort of saying, look, we've got low trust in AI. From the survey, it's also clear that we don't really know when we're using it or not, right? So if we're using it in our social media or our email filters or these sorts of things, we don't really know if AI is present. So our trust is low. We're not sure when we're using it, but we have an appetite to understand more. And so this plays through, I think, to the opportunity from a policy perspective around the AI literacy piece and how we build that base more broadly, because I think this is the other bit that would go a long way towards helping building that trust and the usage and the uptake of these technologies too, is that as we increase people's literacy and knowledge and awareness of what we're talking about, when these applications are being used, the types of situations, how our data is being used, as Nicole spoke to as well, all these sorts of things, that will help build a high trust environment. And that means we can recognise and realise the benefits that, which is what we actually want to get to here. No one wants to see a world where we don't use these applications.
Absolutely. Nicole, Caitlin, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think, there's always more we could talk about, I think, around that kind of policy. I think there's a role for business to be really proactive in working with governments and regulatory bodies around strengthening that regulatory and sort of legal framework. I mean, at the moment, the Data Privacy Act is under review. So I think organisations really can weigh in there. And, you know, I think traditionally there's been a bit of a mentality of businesses against regulation. Regulation slows us down. So we need to make sure that this is fit for purpose regulation. It's not regulation for regulation's sake. And that it really is focused around the key risks and vulnerabilities, the key issues that citizens are worried about, that customers are worried about, that are going to hold them back from embracing these technologies. So I think as long as it's focused around that, and I think this is where that partnership model of the regulatory bodies and government working with business to make sure that that regulation really is fit for purpose. I think it's, you know, we know that it will happen. I mean, if we look to the EU Parliament, you know, they're very active in this space. They've got new AI regulations that they're introducing, AI supervisory bodies that they're discussing about bringing in. So I think we can kind of look to other jurisdictions and see and predict what may come. And also I think just thinking about, well, why have those jurisdictions put those in place? You know, and it is coming from a strong desire from the public for that kind of greater regulation. And I think when people don't understand something, and I think a lot of people feel like, well, I'm probably never going to really understand AI in any depth, so I can't know and I can't mitigate the risks for me or my family or my community. So they want to know that someone else is making sure that, you know, that citizens are being protected and their rights are being maintained.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree, Nicole. Thank you very much. Just a reminder to everyone that's participating, your questions are very welcome in the Q&A panel below. So yeah, please pop some questions in if you have any. Caitlin, this next question is for you. Your findings indicate, obviously, and all our discussions have underpinned this, that Australians have quite a low understanding of AI. Why is that a problem, and what are some of the ways we might be able to address this?
Yeah, that was one of the really interesting things to me and surprising to come out of this, one of the really interesting things to come out of this survey, that just the really sort of, that only half of Australians had roughly seen, heard or read anything about AI in the past year was really surprising to me. The majority of them don't feel that they have a good understanding of what it is or when it's used or where it's used. And that really other interesting piece that Nicole was talking about, where so many of us are unaware that AI is in the applications that we're using on a day-to-day basis. So it really, you know, those low levels of understanding really make it difficult for us to figure out what AI at a general level, what AI can do, what it can't do, where it's being used. I think that it really creates kind of an obstacle for fit for purpose regulation and for people to sort of even decide how they feel about AI, and for us collectively to have a think about what the greater societal impacts are from this technology. And also picking up on biases that may exist when we're not really aware that AI is even in our accommodation sharing app or our social media. But again, I think with that willingness to learn more about AI, we've got opportunities here to really lift up the public understanding. And there's a great model to look to in Finland, where they've in 2018 they've launched their Elements of AI public AI campaign to sort of give Finlanders an edge in the AI space. And I had a look at how that's going, and over 500,000 people, over 500,000 people have already taken this course. They've actually opened it up to the world. And I think that's a really fantastic way to broadly bring everybody into the umbrella of understanding a bit about AI, and encouraging then people that may not know about AI part of developing and interacting with AI, so that those tech developers of tomorrow represent a much broader swath of society. One of the things I thought was really interesting, if you have a look at the Elements of AI page, is 40% of the people that have taken it are women. Yay. So really bringing that diversity into the tech development community and just people interacting with AI. I think in Australia here, we really have an opportunity to deploy something similar and lift up our understanding.
And so I didn't hear you, sorry, you just cut out for a minute. Did you say that initiative in Finland was led by the government, that education initiative?
Yeah, it was led by the government, but they developed it in partnership. They've got a tech consultancy firm called Reactor, I think, and the University of Helsinki. So together they built this thing, and it's a 6-week course. Each module is about roughly 10 hours. I haven't taken the course, but looking at it, it looks like it's really giving a nice overview of a lot of the really important elements of AI. So is that fit for purpose across, from school age all the way up to adult understanding, or is that aimed at a certain demographic? Yeah, no, it's really a sort of, what is AI? Where might I find AI? What is it? What does it mean to me? So really a broad level, general public kind of a service. Oh, fantastic. Excellent. James, Nicole, did you have anything to add to that? That was fantastic, Caitlin. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd just add that, in our report, we talk about the idea of really embracing this literacy piece and actually doing it across the spectrum. So primary school kids, it being in the curriculum, secondary, here at the universities, we're developing a Masters of Business Analytics, which is very heavily in the AI underlying it. I mean, so there is a lot of university activity around this. I believe, parts of CSIRO like Data 61 are already offering for their employees to be able to learn coding. They're supporting them with that. So I think from, business leaders and organisations, there's a lot that they can do to, I think, initially lift the literacy of their own employees. And that's really important, because if employees are engaging or using AI, or, particularly in their service development, then it's important that they really understand it, they understand the ethics behind it, so they can play a role in, mitigating any potential risks. And also the other side of it is really being able to understand it to seize the benefits of it. Often employees can see ways that this could be used, but if they're not even aware of it, it's harder for them to seize that. But I also think organisations can play a real role in terms of educating their customers too, so that customers don't have to be worried about this, and that customers are feeling informed about it as well. So I think in a way we can all play a role in this, in that literacy piece. I think the other thing that organisations can really do to enhance that trust, and it comes from a finding from our survey, we actually found that most Australians believe organisations innovate with AI for financial reasons, basically to benefit them, so to reduce cost, to increase revenue. And they're less likely to believe that it's used to benefit society more broadly, or customers or other stakeholders. And I actually think AI is being used for broader societal purposes, but people perhaps just aren't aware of it. And so they tend to think of this as just being something that, cut labour costs, or increase efficiency and revenue for the companies. So this is where I think, how can organisations use AI to help them, achieve their sustainability goals, for example, or, many large organisations have obligations around identifying, preventing modern slavery in their supply chain, and AI can be really helpful and useful for things like that, to deliver better customer service. So I think that flipping around and maybe communicating how we're using this for the good of society will also help people to see the benefits more so than just the risks that are involved.
Absolutely. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is innovating incredibly in environment, in medical machine learning, and healthcare more broadly, ag tech. There are some absolutely brilliant examples, and I agree with you. At the Queensland AI Hub, we we have a big job ahead of us, which we recognise in broadening the AI literacy of our state and our nation more broadly. But everything that you've said makes 100% sense, and I think it's fantastic. So this next question is to the panel broadly again, so please feel free to jump in. Do you think trust varies? So you've just said, you know, trust of organisations is low because of commercial profit. But then depending on the type of application, does trust vary there? So, you know, applying for a credit card or, you know, versus going in and getting an ultrasound, like what do you think, where does the trust sit on those different applications and what can we learn from that?
James, do you want me to jump in on this one? Or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm happy for you to, Nicole, because I think you can speak specifically to the results in the survey around, you know, the health application in the workplace, because I thought that was quite interesting, those distinctions.
Yeah, so look, we asked in our survey people around AI systems in general, so just generally in AI, but then also we did ask about it in those 4 different domains. So we can speak to some of that. And what the key finding there was that people are generally pretty supportive and accepting and trusting of AI being used for healthcare diagnostic kind of reasons. They were more circumspect around the use in predictive policing, as well as in the other context of basically using AI to help people to make personal investments, like in terms of trading on the stock market. But where they were particularly low was in AI use for that HR analytics. So that's really around informing decision-making around who to hire by sort of playing a role in that shortlisting process, and also in that sort of performance management. And that is one way that AI is being used, particularly overseas. And that's where that was the least sort of trust and support. And I think just to unpack that a little bit better, I think the reason why people are leaning in for the health aspect, the health diagnostic, is because the benefit's really clear for them. Whereas I think in those other contexts, it's not as clear, or they can see potential risks with it. So I think the real takeaway there is around the importance of communicating why the use of AI to support decisions in these kind of contexts, why it can be beneficial, and helping people to recognise and really reassuring them around how the risks are being managed with that, because they will see the risks even if they're not talked about. I think also with healthcare, these are services which are being delivered through a doctor typically. And so in that context, people trust doctors. Here in Australia, we have high trust. So they're really willing to just transfer that. If a professional thinks that this is good to use, then I will trust the professional with this. So part of the results might be reflecting also just the differences in trust in various professions and different sort of services in general. But we did find a bit of a mirroring, because we did ask around just general trust in, for example, in police and in healthcare and in other kind of contexts. And we did see that the AI systems and their trust in the AI systems being used in those domains typically reflected their more broader general trust of those institutions. So this is kind of what helps us to understand, to understand trust in these systems. It's not really simple. It's, it's actually like an ecosystem, if you like. Well, who is this service being mediated through? That is it direct to the customer, or is it through a professional? That makes a difference. Is the broader institution trusted? So if social media is not really trusted, then any sort of AI use within that probably won't be very accepted either.
Do you think that comes back to the transparency of the applications, Nicole? So, you were talking about predictive policing and you're talking about social media, and that comes back to the kind of black box algorithms where it's not transparent, it's not explainable. Financial institutions, for example, do not have to explain to their customers why they've been declined for a credit card or a home loan. They're under no obligation to do so. So that person has got no hope of, appealing that decision, because they don't know on what basis it was made. So I suppose, do you think there's a cleanup needing to be done in those mistrusted, professions, and there's a reason behind that?
Yeah, I think that transparency and explainability piece is really important, and just the general communication in lay terms. It's accessible. It's not, a 5-page legal document, but that just clearly and concisely explains to people, look, this is how your data is going to be used, or this is how this decision has been made. So there's a real art in there around that communication. But I think increasingly people will want this. And we know just from broader work on trust that what we call procedural fairness. So, you know, that the process of making any decision or coming to any outcome, that's a fair process. Now, if that process is a black box and it's impacting citizens or customers, then naturally they're going to find it kind of hard to trust. And also, you know, people kind of hear about whether it's insurance claims or something like that, or insurance premiums, you know, that there's all this data being scraped from these sources that are feeding into that. Now, if that's really going on and happening, then people are actually naturally concerned. Well, hang on, did I give consent for that? Is that appropriate? And that's where I think it comes back to that regulation piece. It's very complex for people to figure out what's going on there. So they want to know that people who have the appropriate skills and knowledge and authority are looking at that and going, this is acceptable practice or it's not. And if it is an acceptable practice, then how do we shift that over time? James, did you have anything else you wanted to add around that?
I think, Nicole, the other thing that comes through when we think about those specific applications is just who's being impacted as well. And I think there's a relationship there with that one around the workplace application that everyone can relate to. And I think for some of the other examples there as well, you may not necessarily be thinking of yourself in that context either. And I think there's a reflection of that coming through it. And I think in the organizational context, what that means then is for us as businesses, we need to think not just about our stakeholders in terms of our customers or people outside of the organisation, but we need to think inside the organisation as well in terms of the application and use of these technologies. Because the other thing that came through in those specific use cases was some very clear expectations on how an organisation might seek to support people who are impacted as well, whether that be through access to reskilling, retraining, other opportunities in terms of how workforce might be redeployed to. So there's some very clear expectations there. And I think that's an important thing to understand.
Absolutely. Nicole, back to you again. What do you think organisations can do to enhance trust in their use of AI? So I suppose that comes back to the discussion we just had, really. You know, there's a number of steps. Do you have any additional insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, I think, in this space of what can be done, and I think there's quite a lot of emerging best practice. So I think and you know, trust comes from trustworthiness. So that's why I keep on coming back to the more that we really understand what the expectations are around trustworthiness, and the more that we can design that into the AI systems and the way that we use them, then over time we're going to get more and more trust in these systems. So I think there's quite a few different things, like in terms of, I think, organizations who are using AI, you know, making sure that there's the appropriate accountability and governance functions, that those structures and those mechanisms are in place, that there is some sort of way of going, okay, this AI system does pose risks, so it needs to be proportional. You know, some AI systems just don't really pose risks, so we don't need to overlay a whole lot of risk management practices on that, but we need some sort of a way to evaluate the risk associated with it, and then for those ones that are moderate to higher risk, having some sort of impact assessment of that done, and then looking at, well, how do we mitigate those before it's released? So I think there's some emerging best practice around that. I think there's also emerging best practice around involving stakeholders right from the very start in the design of it. So really that's a very effective way of making sure that any expectations or any risks are really being identified in a multidisciplinary, you know, multi-stakeholder way. So then you don't get all the way down the development and then realise that actually something's been overlooked because we didn't have the diverse perspectives from the beginning, or actually the uptake on this is going to be challenged, or the legal environment's changed now that makes this difficult to use. So I think that's another best practice that's coming through. I think also just really helping, I think very much investing in the AI literacy of the workforce so that they can really play a role in, you know, understanding the ethical implications of it is an important one as well. Yeah. But I think finally, the one that I would pick up on that James was mentioning is, we know that there are some industries where we're likely to see quite high levels of automation in the future. And I think for the leaders of those organizations, recognizing that and planning for that, so doing that strategic long-term planning of their workforces and investing now in whatever reskilling may be required for those workers, so that we don't see frontline headlines, AI is making all of these people lose their jobs. And it's also just the humane way to go. It's supportive of your employees. And if we are investing in reskilling people now, then that workforce will also be better suited to be able to embrace future technology, that we might see in future ways of using this in the future. So I guess that would be just the last point that I would add there.
Yeah, fantastic. So we've got a couple of questions from our audience, and I think there's time for those. So one is, where does Australia sit in comparison to the rest of the world on this issue? Is there any other nation that we should be modelling ourselves on, or do we just have a distinct set of challenges, being who and where we are? What are your thoughts on that? That's a broad question, by the way, so whoever wants to jump in, please do. Don't be shy.
I can jump in. I just want to make sure that if anyone else wants to. So look, I think there's a couple of ways of answering that. One is, we've looked at how our results compare to other opinion poll surveys done on large population surveys in the US and Europe and other jurisdictions, and broadly the headlines are similar. I think ours is the first one to do a real deep dive around trust, but in terms of expectations of regulations or the kinds of principles, I think there's a lot of commonality. So I think at least across other sort of Western democracies, we can see quite a lot of similarity there. I think we can look to Europe. Europe seems to be at the forefront, and indeed, apparently, some of their reports in that, make quite clearly the idea of the European Union wanting to be known as the place that does trustworthy, ethical AI, and see that as part of their competitive advantage. So I think that we can see that they're investing in that in a range of different ways. And I think that regulatory, legislative, GDPR, all of that is one way of lifting the whole industry in a way, making sure that those minimum standards are really understood. But then for Australia, we might want to be thinking about, if we're going to adopt something similar, how do we tailor that to our unique needs? How do we make it really fit for purpose? How do we make sure it's not overburdensome, that it's not creating a whole lot of work and administration around things that aren't actually the real risks on the ground? So I think that's the challenge with the regulatory and legislative environment, is always thinking about how do you craft that so it's slim and nimble in some ways, but also really focuses on what the real issues are.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And the last one, it's a doozy. So thank you, Shelley, for putting that one in. Should the general public have trust in the fact that trust in AI also comes down to trusting creators of the transformative technology and ensuring that diversity of creators represents the needs of all people and users in society? That's a great one, Shelley. Thank you.
It is a good one, Ali. And I think, it's interesting when you look at the survey and the results that are in there and who people trust to develop and deploy these applications. It speaks in part to this question, right, where we see the level of trust that people have in an organisation reflects as Nicole said, how we might trust those institutions more broadly in society. So there absolutely is a relationship between how we perceive the trustworthiness of an organisation and then the applications that it seeks to develop and deploy. So that is absolutely the case. And I think the second half of that question around making sure that you've got that diversity involved in that creation point is really important, because the second report that we put out that speaks to this model around how you develop trustworthy AI actually looks to involve the whole organisation in that end-to-end life cycle. So it's not just about the coders in that sense or the people who might create this technology. It's also about involving, those good people in risk management, your senior leaders, your clients, your customers at the front end, thinking about supply chain as well. You need all these different elements involved actually in order to make sure what you develop is trustworthy, and to help flush out and identify some of those biases or things that may go wrong, because the real challenge here in part is that people are often most at risk of the vulnerable people.
Yeah, that's right.
When we deploy these technologies, and that's why this is so important. And I think, you know, a really interesting end point to that around the hard work of doing good not being automated. And I think that's right, actually. I don't think you can automate this piece. It is actually about having that diversity of input and being inclusive in that process will actually drive a much better outcome in terms of the applications we design, develop and deploy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, James. Thank you. Nicole?
Yeah, I just echo what James said, and you know, it really does look like emerging best practice in this is to have that diversity, where you know, gender diversity, but functional diversity in terms of disciplinary backgrounds, but also that multi-stakeholders, you know, bringing in end users and you know the diversity of end users that will be involved in any AI system at the end. So thinking about them in the beginning and helping them to be involved in that design stage. I think the other area of that diversity is also on the AI ethics boards or committees, which seems to again be an emerging best practice. You know, in informing those, it really needs to have that diversity in there too, and having community representatives or end user representatives as part of those. You know, this is new terrain. I think that's just important to kind of acknowledge, is that we are entering, you know, this fourth technological revolution, as many people like to call it, and we're at an early stage of it. So it's natural that, you know, mistakes are going to be made, and really what we should be judged on is how quickly can we learn from those mistakes, and how quickly can we create best practices, processes, structures that help us to mitigate that. Just like we do, you know, Genevieve Bell talks a lot about when cars were introduced, you know, or you know, we didn't have driver's license systems, we didn't have road rules, we didn't have all these various speed limits and things to make the driving safe. And you know, just recognizing that we're at this early stage, and the quicker that we can work together to create these kind of safeguards, then the better it will be for everyone. And importantly, the more we'll be able to embrace these technologies and derive the good for it, but whether it's for business, for society more broadly.
It's definitely a multi-layered piece. I've thought that often, you know, there's a piece of trust, but behind that is, you know, dealing with the organisations that are creating it and helping them to understand the power of diversity, and telling them to, you know, look at and overcome their own unconscious bias. So it is multi-layered and it's very interesting. Caitlin, did you have any final thoughts?
Oh, no, look, I think that there's my colleagues stated it so well. I think bringing, I just can't overstate, you know, I feel bringing the diversity into the design teams, and also, as they've said, recognizing that AI isn't just about the design teams. AI is about all these other groups within the organization and the external stakeholders, and frankly, the policymakers that also need to be diverse, and bringing those views into regulating these technologies is the key.
Yeah, definitely agree, Pepper, that's for sure. Well, that takes us to time. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. I thoroughly enjoyed that discussion, and I hope everyone who attended did as well. So I'd like to wish you all a very happy Friday and a good weekend. So thank you very much for joining us today.